Blood satellite.
I'm going to read another little rant here that I think might capture my tone a bit better. It's by this individual named Basil at Neo Bactrian. I don't know too much about this guy. I've heard a thing or two about him, but I don't know. Whatever. I'm just going to read his post. He says, a lot of you motherfuckers owe me a lot of apologies. And a lot of you notable figures need to be men and start taking out the trash. Why is it that women... He kind of censors it here, but I'm just going to read it from what I think he's saying. Why is it that women, faggots, and trannies think they can punch right and gatekeep here? Why is it that Palestinian Medgold and Radfem Hitler jump in to attack this man when he said nothing wrong? It's because, like I've been telling you for 3 years, this media market has been paused by the faggots and trannies and wannabe artists hiding under Anna's skirt as she's made the transition from post-left to dissident right. Fair enough. Every take seller and notable figure here knows that she has connections to more mainstream media outlets, and everyone turns a blind eye to the post leftists she smuggled in who feel emboldened by the fact that no one wants to draw attention to their subversion lest they be misconstrued as counter-signaling Anna and effectively cut them out from the connections she's perceived to have.
Yep.
So like Jack... So people like Jack get to punch right on the basis of being gay while running his dick pic extortion racket, and Pariah, which is another individual, thinks she can dunk on real men because he knows that every wannabe take seller attached to Anna's ass like a barnacle will jump to her defense because, especially in the case of Jack and Monica, everyone knows they're psychotic and emotionally unstable and will blow up the whole thing by spilling the gossip they already know. Don't say no one told you. I mean, yep. I mean, fair enough.
All true. So clout chasing random media personalities because they're well connected and because you think you can get money out of them. If you don't have an active use for that network or that money and you're chasing the clout, I mean, you're making it worse just by being there and being involved in it. I'm sorry, but you're fucking making it worse. And that's what these guys are doing. And it isn't just Anna. Anna obviously is a big part of the problem, but we're talking about the number of people who are just turning a blind eye and not saying anything. I'm not involved in this scene. I feel like I'm at least doing my part by publicly saying Anna is a turncoat and a fucking bitch. She's not one of us, and anybody else who interacts with her is also not one of us. I mean, tell me I'm fucking wrong. And by the way, we've said a million times, there's no such thing as a right-wing gay. There's no such thing as a right-wing troon. They're all out. They're all enemies. And anybody who's standing up for them or platforming them, they're also the enemy. They're just interlopers. They're just people who are pretending to be like you so they can take your fucking money and ruin your group. But the other thing that we don't talk about often enough, although we have mentioned it, there's no such thing as a right-wing female pundit. That's a fucking joke. Women are not political figures. Women are not leaders. Women are not philosophers. If a woman is telling you how to live, you should be embarrassed. You should be really, really, really embarrassed if you're reading a Substack that was written by a woman.
Monster. It's kind of over.
I'm sorry that so many people need to fucking hear that, but if half of the people that you follow on Twitter are like female political take makers, what the fuck, man? What? Just delete. Why are you even
the reason
responding
most
to
people
them?
Follow them is probably because of gossip. Probably because if you follow these, you're going to get subtweets.
But then there we caught you with your fucking pants down, didn't we? Because that isn't about principles anymore. That's literally you're just clout and gossip chasing. You should, again, all I can say is you should be really fucking embarrassed, and maybe you should take a break. Maybe you should turn the phone off for a couple of months.
I thought it was well known that anytime you invite trannies in, they just start problems. 100%. I've seen it happen a few times. You see that this Evelyn that we've talked about,
Absolutely.
There's a lot of people who were from communities they've been in where it's like they're causing problems. They're trying to like troll guys by pretending to be a woman and laughing at them when they find out, like just starting shit you don't want to have. They're not going to bring anything to the table that has any utility to what you want to do. There's no reason to fucking have them around. Just say fuck off.
Yeah.
What good idea is a tranny going to have? It's just a countdown until they blow this fucking thing up. And I thought that went without saying.
The wonderful thing about social media too is you don't have to interact with these people. You can just delete them, block them, unfollow. You don't even have to use social media as a pro tip. You can just not. Unless you are, like, I know that the reason you do it, the reason you're on Twitter is because we have this show and you're actively promoting our show so we can make some money and so that we can get more viewers. I get it. But for most people that are on Twitter, they're there because that's their parasocial dopamine rush for the day. Like, and also people who are, again, I'm not going to name names, but there's people on there who are clout chasing for the sake of clout chasing. I'm networking for the sake of networking. It's like, for what, dude? Like, when I network, I'm networking in a specific industry because I have products to sell, because I own a company. That's what networking actually is, dumbass. If you don't have a business or a company or a product or a service, that's not networking. That's just you feeling good and trying to fucking grift people.
You know, like, I don't know if I can really connect these points, but I feel like something's there. I've been watching a lot of rodeo clips lately.
I want to see how this connects.
I've been watching clips and little documentaries and footage of this bull rider named JB Money. Fascinating guy who just retired because known to be the greatest bull rider, of all time.
It come to him natural, It's a different thing that most people, I guess, don't have, in their blood or in their body. It's just a dirty, rotten, tough cowboy.
That's what everyone's saying. Other bull riders are doing it. And a lot of people don't know about bull riding. I didn't know about it, but I heard people whispering about this guy, and he looks like a cowboy and he acts like a cowboy. And you see videos of him. A lot of people are if you ever seen bull riding, it's no joke, right?
I don't think you can compare like Hitler to people that are worried about climate change. The worry that I have here is...
But a lot of people wear helmets. He doesn't wear a helmet. He's wearing a fucking cowboy hat. He's smoking a Marlboro cigarette, right? And he just retired at age 37 because he broke his fucking neck. But he's the real deal. And he isn't even technically the top rodeo guy, not the top bull rider, because other people might have scored more points or won more championships, but he's revered in the scene for a few reasons. Legend status, because first and foremost, like he it's the love of the sport from him. So oftentimes he had said he'll pick the toughest bull to try and ride, and oftentimes he'll lose. But he's like, I want to just pick the nastiest bull. And it's so funny. There's this bull that he had a rivalry with named Bushwhacker. And this was like the meanest, biggest bull he'd ever seen. And he rode it like a dozen times and lost every single time and won it that one time. But it was like this notorious rivalry where he'd go up and like shit talk the bull beforehand. And like the bull like knew him and didn't like him either. Real like folk tale type stuff. Anyway, but that's what made him famous, because they said that's real cowboy shit. Like it was just like, I'm going to do it because I want to ride the toughest bull. The second thing about him is that he actually is a cowboy. He rides a horse. He has a ranch. He goes fucking roping cattle all day. And like he is, a lot of people might look at that and think like Yellowstone, that show. But he seems like a guy pulled from that show. But he is, for all intents and purposes, a cowboy.
Being a cowboy is a lifestyle. That's what I was raised to be. I didn't much want to do anything else. I rode bucking horses. I rode calves.
No, not every bull rider does it. A lot of them guys don't even know how to ride a horse. Don't want to ride a horse, but I'd rather be a cowboy than just a bull rider any day.
And they say he's like the last of his breed, the last of that type of guy. Who's just like riding the bull without the helmet on and smoking cigarettes while he's doing it. And even he makes a point of saying like this new breed of bull riders, they're almost too technical about it. And he had made a point. He said, first of all, let me say, a lot of guys would look at this guy like he's like a legend. He's a mythical creature. We don't know how he does it because he's 5'10", says he's 5'10", probably 5'9", right? He's 140 pounds. He's called scrawny, right? So you're thinking, wow, the fuck is this guy riding a bull? He must have some magic power. But if you watch the documentary, he's like, it's not about strength. You're never going to out-wrangle a fucking 1,800-pound bull. But he says it's all about balance. And if you watch him, all he does for like hours a day is he stands on like the soccer ball and balances on it.
Balance for me is a huge part. It doesn't matter how big you are, you're not going to out-muscle a damn 1,800-pound bull. Standing on it like that, the way it rolls, and the way you have to move your weight, is just like a bull. It's worked for me. I feel like that's the main reason I move my hips so good is standing on this thing all the time. I did it for an hour a day for a long time, you know. If I didn't have anything to do, that's where I'd be. I'd be inside standing on this ball. Watching bull riding tapes, eating a sandwich where you could walk in, I'd talk to you and never get off the ball.
When he rides a bull, other people will kind of size up the bull and look up YouTube videos, look up archival footage of the bull. How does it react? How do you get a game plan going? He does the opposite. It's like muscle memory for him. He's like, if I start studying the stats and studying the videos, I make a game plan in my head.
If I don't know what the bull does, then my body reacts on its own. I ride him jump for jump. If I know what he does, in the back of my head, I'm setting a game plan for him. You set a trap for a bull, you get caught in it every time.
And like Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? So he's like, you just kind of, you live in the moment. You rely on like your guts and it's in your blood and you respond in real time. And that's how he won that's why he's a fucking legend. He actually used this to win. But him being a cowboy, he said like the fact that he actually rides a horse also helps too. The fact that he lives the life of this type of individual that was everywhere 100 years ago. Now no one does it. Now you just have this new breed of bull riders, and that's all they do, and they obsess about stats. And the only thing they do is like, I'm a bull rider. That's the one thing I do. I don't know any other cowboying skills.
Bull riding's getting to be a bigger sport. It's starting to become more mainstream. The generation I see now is getting farther and farther away from being cowboys. I think that eventually it'll consist of just guys that ride bulls.
And that's why they'll never be great. That's why they'll never have, like, you can study and learn little tricks all fucking day, and maybe you can win a few titles, but you'll never have it in your blood. You'll never have that power of improvisation to really like shock and awe people. And I just, when I look at all these individuals in the scene, like when we talk about the white supremacist scene, we talk about first principles, it's because there's something deeper. There's something deeper that just manifests as this one thing. But if you don't have the deeper first principles, if you don't have that love of just the love of this one thing, you're not there because it's cool. You're not there because it's flashy. You're not there because you want to win a medal. You're there because that is what you are. And you'll be there when it's popular. You'll be there when it's not popular. And you'll be doing it until you break your fucking neck. And there's not a lot of people in the scene that I see who are like that. I don't see a JB Money in this fucking space of faggots and trannies, right? They're down here in the fucking muck, and they've been here forever. And they're never going to have that ability to be a legend at it, because they're just technical. They're just trying to bet on, they're into this thing now because it's popular. Yeah. And then maybe they just stop. They don't go back to being a cowboy, but they don't go back to being anything.
Yeah.
Anyway, it just made me think of the people who do something because it's substance, because it's substantive, because it's just connected to this deeper identity and this deeper drive and this passion. And so that's why when I look at these spaces, I do, I don't know if I should say, it's like I do question the practicality and the strategy of even dealing with these fucking people. You know what I mean? Like just having them there, like, do I even want them around?
I don't fault anybody for dealing with them, because there's many different strategies, but I don't deal with them, and that isn't out of laziness. I actively avoid dealing with them. And I know you have to temper me, because I will just tell every single fucking person to fuck off. But I don't see every second that I spend interacting with one of these people, if there's even one thing wrong with them, I'm going to regret it, because I could have spent it with my family. I could have spent it on my business. I could have spent it in my garden. Like And most of these people are so, like, the Dime Square thing especially, like, Anna is so fucking damaged. Everything about her history and her as a person is just toxic, whore, left-wing trash. But now a mid girl is going to say some right-wing shit about the Jews, and suddenly everybody's dick is hard. And I mean, it's not even that I don't want to talk to her. I don't talk to her. I'm not on Twitter. But to hear the number of people that like want to induct her into our space makes me want to leave my own circle. Like, makes me want to just delete Telegram, right? Because like I don't know why. Like, what do I get out of dealing with this? Like, I'm not here to fucking teach
Also,
people.
you can tell these people apart when they'll agree with our points. Then you ask them, well, what do you want to do about it? You agree that, you know, Jews have these proclivities. What do you want to do about it? Do you want to
subscribe to my Substack to find out?
Yeah. Or like ask any action. Do you want to take any action on this? Like, no, it's what? I don't want it. Like, you know, like they don't want to do the next thing, right? Like if you love Steve Saylor, all you motherfuckers love Steve Saylor now, don't you? We've loved Steve Saylor for a long time because he complains about black people. He cites the crime statistics. And you love citing crime statistics because that's in the zeitgeist. 14 do 50 black crime. It's like, okay, what do you want to do about it?
Let's talk about solutions. Oh no, but now I'm a horrible racist because we're talking about solutions. Now you're going to gatekeep me, like the example that you brought up earlier. Like you have troons who are supposed to be right wing, but as soon as you start talking about real right wing shit, the stuff that's still actually dangerous to talk about, you get gatekept by the fucking troons who came in the back door. And this is the reason you close the back door.
All these women would be gender essentialists. They would say, yes, men and women exist. There is a binary. But if you make fun of their trans friend or imply that their trans friend is mentally ill and you probably shouldn't have them as a friend, then they get mad at you. But like, no, that it logically and naturally follows. If you believe X, it leads to Y. If you believe that trannies are mentally ill men and they're corrupted, which a lot of them might say, then why are you hanging out with them? Oh no, these ones, no, let's not be like, you actually just haven't changed your fundamental nature of being an esoteric girl boss, a girl boss who's just into weird shit, as long and because it's been made comfortable for you by other people who put their fucking lives and careers on the line. Oh, it's safe to talk about Jews now. It's safe to talk about, you know, the trannies. There's people like getting fined and going to jail for saying this shit. You can still get fined in jail for that in Canada. In 7 years, you're going to be on Holocaust stuff now.
You know what? I wanted to come back to the to delineate the difference between these types of people. The bull riding example, I kind of like that because it isn't just about the bull rider by day guys like the weekend bull riders who aren't cowboys at all versus the cowboy. Those two guys are kind of similar to each other in a way, but if you think about it, the JB Money, if there was no such thing as a bull riding competition and the world ended tomorrow, he'd find a fucking bull to ride somewhere because it's in his blood. The weekend bull rider, the only reason he's even there is because there's women there and money in it, and the only reason there's women and money is because JB Money is there bringing the crowd, right? And then there's on the far end of the spectrum is guys like you and me watching it on YouTube with only a very passing interest. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the pure Hyperborean end is a literal, actual platonic cowboy who has never seen a stadium and rides bulls because all he eats is beef and beans and howdy and Marlboros and the whole fucking shtick, the whole thing. That, and you could call that the principle. That's the pure manifestation of what JB Money represents. JB Money is only a little piece, but he's the genuine article and he's the only piece left. He's like the last of his kind, you know?
Yeah.
Even though
the rest is just fakeness.
He's not a ranch hand. He doesn't spend, 9 days out on the mesa hunting rustled cattle or whatever. He probably lives in a trailer park. But the point is his life and his principles and what he searches for is much closer to that. He rides bulls because of who he is.
I will say though, JB Money does have a ranch that he runs, like it's his ranch.
Well, there you go. So he's so much closer to that.
He is like the only bull rider that's made like $7 million just riding bulls because he is sponsored. It's so fucking funny. He's wearing like the vest and the fucking chaps. It's all like Monster Energy all over it. I'm like, yes.
Okay, well, you're fucking blowing me up here now, but fuck.
No, that's good. Like, why not? Like, he's just a guy. I'm like, okay, well, why not? He wouldn't have some kind of anti-capitalist thing. He's like, okay, I'll put your fucking patch on my coat if you want to give me $100,000 for my daughter so she can like ride sheep. So I do, because that's what you do before you go to bulls. You go ride sheep around as a kid. But anyway, that's really, I know we spent a lot of time on that, but this is just a roundabout way, just to wrap that up before we go to the next thing, of saying that I'm taking a closer look at the interaction between spaces. That's what this is about. It's the interaction between our space of heterodox, weird, schizo concepts, how that is actually connecting to capital and finance and money, and the intermediary spaces that I'm losing trust in, because I think those can corrupt the message. And I think even on the right, the conservative side, like the MAGA people are getting their thing corrupted by, you know, other intermediaries as well, their own grifters, their own people who are trying to take some of these more, you know, essential ideas and kind of reappropriate them to something else.
And you know what? Because I have some experience with this. Again, I was saying earlier about industry. Like, I've worked in a few different industries. I'm even doing this now. I mentioned the other day, I was talking in the chat, that part of my job right now is actually maintaining a very old whisper network of old engineers across Southern Ontario in a specific industry. Guys who are retiring and have not handed anything on, and trying to rebuild some relationships so that a lot of this business continues to happen. And I've done something similar in my previous work in Hong Kong. And what I know is networks, real valuable networks where products and services and lots of money, like investment through trust, actually happens. Like, when those things change hands, you cannot buy or sell those. So I think there's something already broken if you have a quote unquote networking space. Like, there's a lot of places that will sell this. Like, the bottom end of this is the free real estate networking event at the ACC or whatever, where every board mom goes, and it's free, but they pay $750 for a book to learn how to do nothing, right? So, like, that's not a networking event. You don't have anything to sell. There's no target. You don't have a relationship. Most networks that matter are people with real things and skills who know other people with real things and skills, and they introduce party A to party B, and they vouch for them. And there's an exchange of social value there. Like, these are real networks. And the reason they're so valuable is because they're so fucking rare, and they're so hard to create. They can only be created authentically and organically. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is if somebody is pitching you on a space like Twitter or wherever, where you can just go and, oh, there's going to be lots of money people here, believe me, and we can get lots of investment. And actually it's like, no, it's almost certainly not. It's almost certainly going to be you're the one giving money, or you're the one giving time, or you are the product. Really, you're just a face in a crowd in order to make the thing sell more Monster energy drinks. So, like, that, it's not real. It's not real. And my point is, we have not cracked investment in our thing. The psychos have come in and they've figured out how to get investment into adjacent shit, but that doesn't help us. Because it's apples and oranges trying to get investment in a grift to build a Haitian island versus investing in, like you said, what did you say? A
sort of like a decentralized, like
education system. This is something that is completely different. And you're not going to be able to, I don't think you're going to get investors in that. I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying, using that as an example. I don't think the way to get investors on that is be a shit taker on Twitter with people who are largely ex-left wingers.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree completely. I'm going to segue this very cleanly into the next thing, because
nice.
the connecting node between these two things is the journalist. Because a lot of people would think of the journalist, even in a classical sense, like a mid-20th century journalist, as someone, and their first principle would be the truth. And oftentimes journalists, like I see so many fucking shows and movies about journalists, and there's nothing less interesting to me than a movie or show about a journalist.
Yeah.
I had to stop watching Tokyo Vice for that reason. Tokyo Vice is an HBO show that has a lot of good things about it if it just got rid of the main character, who is a white Jewish, but played by a white guy, I'm pretty sure, in Japan, uncovering a really interesting story that should actually just be like a fucking Tokyo, Hong Kong crime detective thriller. But you need to follow this. Like, you know, everyone's talking about Tokyo Vice being canceled. Why does HBO hate Tokyo Vice? I watched the first like 4 or 5 episodes. I can tell you why I think it's getting canceled at season 2. It's because it's really fucking boring, and it's got the worst main character probably in television history. Not only the character, but also the actor. Point being that I see other shows like The Girls on the Bus, a movie about 4 journalists following around more interesting people, right? But they're all possessed by this idea that journalists are the truth tellers, and they'll talk about, you know, the New York Times, they'll talk about the Washington Post, they'll talk about these pillars of society that even if maybe they're corrupt now, that at one point they were all the news that's fit to print. That's what the New York Times would say. But it turns out that journalists are full of shit, and that was never the case. And that's why we hate journalists, because anyone who knows anything knows that there was never a time when any journalist was anything other than a paid talking head or a star fucking weirdo or just like a girl with a tape recorder who's looking for gossip. That's what it is. And so I read this book, and it's pretty interesting. It's called The Gray Lady Winked: How the New York Times Misreporting, Distortions, and Fabrications Radically Alter History. And it's written by an individual named Ashley Rindsberg. You're in Rindsberg, you're thinking Jewish. You're thinking, oh no. Well, I got news for you, pal. This is also a man that wrote this. This is a man named Ashley. So, yeah, you gotta put your fucking wedding shoes on for this.
Here we go.
It's gathering some instances going back to like the mid and early 20th century where the New York Times, the vanguard of truth, was shown to be outright lying at worst, and even at best they're ideologically possessed and choosing to put a good face on a bad story, or essentially push communism in the United States of America as like one of the leading forces of communist apologia in America.
It is the pinnacle for journalists. That's where they want to be. It's where they want to spend their careers if they can. And that, again, it's that level of influence that makes it truly unique, that they're able to not just set the policy agenda, set the news agenda, but they're essentially shaping reality. I mean, they are syndicated and licensed to thousands of other news organizations around the globe. And they just command that respect and power among the right people. But on the other side, the second part of that is what this reveals as well. I mean, that's part of the cause, but what does this show us? And partly, I think, for me, is that the New York Times is really the template of corporate media. They really had perfected that structure of news for profit that is controlled by a single family.
It tries to open with some, it did this to the right wing too. It did this to Hitler. The only example they had was like a misreporting. It was when they thought Hitler wouldn't invade Europe. Like a reporter had said that, I have a feeling that he's not going to invade Poland. And they were wrong about that. But the rest of the book very clearly shows the editorial bias towards promoting communist events or outright involvement in communist revolutions occasionally. And really the reason I wanted to talk about this book is because I think it connects to our previous discussion, because like at the heart of this revered and respected agency, it's the exact same type of individuals we're talking about. It's people who are there for vibes. It's people there because it's cool to work at the New York Times. No one there really has any appreciation of this thing called the truth.
New York Times, as you know, Michael, it's not just a newspaper. It is a symbol. It's a symbol of the news industry, the news media. It's a symbol of what we call the fourth estate in the US. It's also disproportionately powerful. It sets not only the news agenda, it sets the policy agenda. The New York Times says it's true. People consider it to be true, whatever it might be. And that is in part because there's this ecosystem built around it that includes, the Pulitzer Prize. The New York Times has won more Pulitzer Prizes than any other newspaper by far. There's almost twice as many as the next competitor. And when it prints something about the 1619 Project, which you alluded to, people just accept it. And that just becomes the prevailing narrative.
And so we look at journalism, and we're talking about political activism in our space. We're talking about the distant sphere, but journalism represents, I think, the worst and most mutated form of what we're talking about. And I just want to give some people examples of how much the New York Times fucking sucks. And it's interesting that we bring this up because the scene that we're talking about, the Dime Square scene, is affiliated with Curtis Yarvin, and Curtis Yarvin famously talked about the New York Times as the leader, the apex of the cathedral, the cathedral, as he describes it, which is just the consensus maker of America. So that would be academia plus the respected press. Because everyone knows, like, there's really only like 4 or 5 newspapers that matter, news organizations that matter in America. New York Times is one of them. The New York Times has the power to set the new national conversation. They still do. They did even more in the past, but they fucking still do. And if you understand that they can be ideologically driven, like, they can sway elections, they can not so much now, but for a long time they could. And what does it happen when it turns out that this one Jewish family at the head of it seems to like Castro, seems to like the Soviet Union, right? So I'm just going to start reading some stuff here that I think is relevant. For much of the 20th century, the Times was seen as a standard bearer of the truth. It is because of this unique standing that the 7 words that constitute the Times' famous slogan, "All the news that's fit to print," have been printed atop each day's edition since 1897 without irony or embarrassment. But for many news consumers today, including some of the paper's most loyal readers, the picture of a truth-bearing newspaper that went to the ends of the earth to bring readers the unadorned facts feels like a quaint relic from a bygone era. Over the past years, the Times has increasingly become not only a point of political contention, but a flashpoint of scandal. Now, this guy, he's a liberal. You know, there's nothing about this Ashley fella that would be, you know, adjacent to the right or anything. But, you know, I would say that there was no point in the New York Times' history where it wasn't ideologically or agenda driven. In fact, I don't think any newspaper in the history of newspapers has. And everyone acknowledges that newspapers from their inception were just mouthpieces for power, mouthpieces for corrupt mayors or corporations or whoever the fuck. Anyone can start a newspaper. Now, here's a quote. It says, "To put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs." These were the words that Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Russia during the early Soviet years, used to explain the devastating Ukrainian famine of the 1930s perpetuated by the government. So this is like the New York Times is man on the ground in the Soviet Union saying, well, you got to break an omelet. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Explaining the fucking the Holodomor. Walter Duranty is still today widely associated with journalistic malfeasance on account of his attempt to cover up the Ukrainian famine. The 300-pound gorilla of a question that has gone unasked concerning Duranty is why he would cover up a famine so severe that it would have been obvious to even a casual observer. Walter Duranty relied on extremely dubious, vague, and unnamed sources to report on one of the most consequential international stories of the decade.
I mean, whatever the motivation was, it can't be good. The best I can think of that would make the most sense to me is status, right? He was the dean of the Moscow Press Corps. He was, you know, the big shot. And basically, if it's revealed that he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, as it was, and as he admitted, it's like, well, then what good are you?
He was a journalistic superstar amongst the most famous reporters in America and possibly even the world. Duranty could not have achieved this fame without a huge platform that the Times provided him, which not only legitimized his opinions but projected his voice on the international stage. A globe-trotting, one-legged British writer known among journalists for his sexual philandering, openness to drugs, and the depth of his education. So we still had those guys running around back then. And here's why that matters. So while Duranty's meeting with President Roosevelt was one in a long chain of similar conferences, it was the meeting with Duranty, the article claimed, that served to bring to the fore the report that the governor was contemplating, in the event of being elected president, a new policy towards the Soviet. According to the Times, Duranty, who had been awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his Russia reporting, mind you, just 2 months beforehand, had been brought in to make the case for a pro-Soviet shift in American-Russian relations. So here's literally a pro-Soviet guy meeting with the president, given that platform because he writes for the New York Times, literally dictating international policy. That's the power that the Times would have. Walter Duranty is now largely considered a media outlier or an anomaly, a reporter whose character flaws slipped through the editorial cracks of the institution. But the reality is that Duranty fits a prominent pattern in the Times of a star reporter whose celebrity enables him or her to commit journalistic malfeasance in plain sight of his editors. It was his Pulitzer Prize that inducted Walter Duranty into a class of the New York Times elites, which gave the correspondent a virtual free pass that got even the most egregious news articles past the editors without so much as a quick glance. So Walter Duranty got in trouble for this. They wanted to retract his Pulitzer Prize. Now enters the New York Times owner, the Sulzbergers. So the New York Times is owned by the Sulzberger family. I'm just going to leave that there. I'm not going to say anything about that. According to the Times' own reporting, the Sulzbergers wrote a cover letter to the consultants report recommending that they retract the Pulitzer Prize. That was to be delivered to the board of the newspaper. Sulzberger argued in his cover letter that the Times had, for more than 2 years, acknowledged the slovenly nature of his reporting, but they shouldn't need to return the prize. So it's like, yes, his reporting was fucking erroneous and, catastrophic, but I don't think we should have to return the prize. Sulzberger's first rationalization as to why the Times should not return the Pulitzer Prize was the outrageous excuse that the newspaper did not have the Pulitzer Prize and so couldn't return it. Like, I don't have it. What do you mean you don't have it, you fucking asshole? The Ochs-Sulzberger family, that's what they're known as, the Ochs-Sulzberger family, which still runs the New York Times today, is a mainstay of the left-leaning, educated, and generally wealthy American intellectual elite that supported the Soviet experiment and its utopian aims from the beginning. Now, there's never going to be any mention in this book of Jewish this or that, but, let's just, again, leave that there for the listener to decide. And it gets even worse. So we now move on to another correspondent named Ella Winter. Ella Winter, a communist agent in the United States who was married to the notorious correspondent Lincoln Steffens, compared Russia's economic difficulties to a woman's birth pains. Is the woman happy bearing the long-awaited child? They're giving birth to a new world outlook. And in this process, questions of personal gratification become secondary. What the Times may or may not have known was that Winter was a communist agent handled by the infamous Will Musenberg, the man who helped direct global propaganda for the Communist International, or Comintern, which was founded to spread the communist revolution to all corners of the world. So basically, the New York Times was staffing one communist agitator and also one literal communist propaganda agent. A glance at Winter's obituary in the New York Times in 1980 further underscores the point. The obituary makes no mention of her political background, but writes her simply as an interpreter of economic changes. The idea that Winter was a neutral observer points to the somewhat disturbing fact that the Times' ownership and management was an ideological lockstep with a Soviet propaganda operative. George Bernard Shaw, Ella Winter, and maybe more than any single person, Walter Duranty, were opinion makers when it came to the topic of Soviet Russia. Moving on to Fidel Castro is another example. We're moving to another journalist named Matthews. Despite Matthews' colorful background, it was an act of journalistic integrity and intrepidness for the Times reporter, then nearing 60, to trek into the Sierra Maestra mountains in search of the rebel leader Castro in 1957. Matthews had championed the idea that Castro was a pro-democracy and therefore anti-communist. Which proved not to be true at all. But that was just to launder Castro's image to Americans too. So for people who are curious, who are just unpacking that in their mind, there was a time when Fidel Castro was sold to America as anti-communist. His name is Herbert Matthews. Herbert Matthews had launched Castro. Not only was he favorable, he launched Castro onto the world stage in 1957. Instead of investigative reporting on the Cuban rebel group or a careful and critical analysis of the group's origins, Matthews and the New York Times printed romantic stories of the rebels and their youthful vision of a liberated and democratic Cuba. Matthews' flowery descriptions of Castro's movement as a movement of the people, of the youth, of the economic classes, and most importantly, of democracy, traveled around the world. So he's making a case, and I think this is true, that there would be no Cuban revolution without the New York Times projecting that to the entire world as something that is of global interest. And they did this with Soviet regimes around the world, or rather communist regimes around the world, but all in one way or another connected to the Soviet Union. And not only that, the New York Times took the extra step of like hosting Castro in New York. Castro had not come to New York just to bask in glory. The newly installed Cuban leader was so grateful for what the Times had done for him that he felt it incumbent to show his appreciation and to do so in person. On April 21st, 1959, Castro strode into the New York Times building where he was greeted by a few very important people. One of them was Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the newspaper and head of the family. I mean, like, really, like, if you're trying to make a case that the New York Times is not ideologically tilted, you know, like, anyone who says that to you is just ignorant, or they're just communists themselves. There's another interesting case of this, a reporter named Halberstram, a very, very good name for a very, very bad guy, who was the reporter, the man on the ground in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Two guys named Halberstram and Sheehan. The claims that they were directly involved in the coup d'etat in Vietnam. It says here, the involvement of Halberstram and Sheehan in the coup d'etat was not just direct, it was also explicit. The journalists themselves, if not boasting, spoke confidently about their role in overthrowing the Diem government in their later articles and books. One of Halberstram's earlier Times articles, titled Diem Regime Under Fire, presented a narrative of boiling discontent in the government on behalf of the Vietnamese people. There's some other cases in here that he mentions that are kind of interesting. The one that takes aim at the U.S. government was that the Times, for one reason or another, was trying to cover up during when the nuclear bombs were being tested originally, and after they were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were trying to cover up that there was radiation sickness involved. And there was a couple reporters involved in that. The main guy was named William H. Lawrence. So there was stories coming out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that even after the bombs dropped, there was all these people dying and they didn't know why. And there were some rumors that there was radiation involved, but the U.S. wanted to suppress that because they still wanted to research more about these bombs. And people got wind that, you know, it was causing people to get cancer and all these weird diseases. No one would, like, the public would turn against research in the atomic bombs entirely. But, you know, so there's a case made here that these journalists were actually trying to, you know, dismiss these reports on behalf of the U.S. government. I think there's a good enough case made in that story, in this book rather. As this book has shown, the New York Times has a disturbing history of keeping quiet about major world-changing errors, lies, and fabrications that have been made in its pages. The proverbial moose has often, too often, gone unnoticed, but on occasion, the moose comes rampaging through the glass facade of the Times building on 8th Avenue. This is exactly what happened in 2003 when a junior staff reporter named Jayson Blair resigned from the paper. By that point, Blair had lied, fabricated, and plagiarized and committed just about every other conceivable journalistic sin during his short career at the New York Times. And it was at that moment that a series of articles by a highly regarded veteran Times reporter named Judith Miller concerning the presence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq started unraveling.
The Jayson Blair debacle became shorthand for all of the shortcomings of the news business. Because it happened at the New York Times, because there were so many stories involved, this became an explosion.
It began as a reporting scandal and then quickly turned into a near mutiny by the staff.
The New York Times is calling it a huge black eye. Was the paper too eager to promote an appealing young black voice?
It became about race because a black person was involved. A black person cannot be involved in anything without it being about race.
Jayson Blair, who very clearly was plagiarizing, just making up articles, making up news stories. It says here, a series of articles on the devastating effects of the war in Iraq came with relentless consistency. He was publishing articles on April 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 11th, 15th. Like, it's actually impossible for him to have, like, reported from all these places. He would be, like, running around hundreds and hundreds of miles, like, writing as he's in a plane. Basically, he was just very clearly faking articles about the Iraq war, which is actually something that happened to the New York Times a lot. Like, they loved the idea of, there was no atrocity or massacre that the New York Times wouldn't put on his front page, even if it was clearly fabricated. Oddly, the management at the time did not find the physics-defying pace unusual, or if they did, no one did anything about it. On the contrary, Blair's stories got more and more play, with 2 of them making the front page of the Times. The problem was that virtually all of Blair's reporting from the period was fraudulent, either plagiarized, embellished, or completely fabricated. Rather, it was a reporter from a different newspaper who realized Blair had plagiarized significant pieces of his own stories. There's also a couple of series they ran. I don't know if people remember this. There was this series on the Iraq War titled The Women's War that they were publishing in 2007 on the special, the unique impacts that being a female soldier has. They interviewed some female soldiers. All of it made up. All of it bullshit. They were just making up stories about how these like women were raped in the military. It never fucking happened. There's another series they had called War Torn about American combat soldiers coming home from the war in Afghanistan. The Times' own description of this series made no bones about what it was to be about. A series of articles and multimedia about veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan who have committed killings or been charged with them. The article provided some horrifying statistics. More than 50% of the killings involved guns. While the others were stabbed. Like, basically, they're trying to make a case that soldiers who commit violence in a war zone come home and commit violence at home, which is actually a statistic that I think a lot of people would probably agree with, right? Like, there's trauma, you come home, and turns out it's all fucking fake. It's not real. There's this, and I think that even persists in a lot of our culture, that these soldiers are just ticking time bombs where they shoot their family. The way they started measuring the quote unquote violence, some of it was even self-defense. Like, oh, these soldiers, they come home and they get involved in all this gun crime. And like, they started looking at the cases of gun crime. It's like, well, a third of these are actually self-defense. Like, they're fighting off muggings and shit. But like, they want to tell a story where this war is making ticking time bombs back home. It's just, it wasn't fucking true at all. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I'd be willing to bet that a lot of our understanding of how, like, the idea that PTSD makes serial killers or makes ticking time bombs, I bet that's not true. I bet, like, even if you kill an enemy combatant, it doesn't make you more likely to shoot your fucking family. I don't think it is. Like, that's just my gut feeling. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think that's just a bunch of horse shit cooked up by the Sulzbergers. It says here, things still deteriorated. Taking a list at some of the veterans, including in the times of peace, we see that many of these men did not commit violent crimes at all, and that the violent crimes of the others had very little, if anything, to do with having been in a war. For example, one former soldier on the list, Brian Epting, was convicted of vehicular homicide. His crime, he lost control of his car while drag racing and ended up hitting a man who was killed by the impact. So it's like, oh yeah, but you know, that's because of the PTSD. No, he's just a fucking moron who likes to drag race. We have seen that time and time again, from the Soviet Russia to Castro's Cuba to the Holocaust to the atomic bombs in Japan, that when the top power structures of the New York Times got involved in a story, the story got blown out in the worst possible way. In the case of America's wars, especially the war in Iraq, the then publisher of the paper and chairman of the New York Times Company made no attempt to hide or dilute his opinion about America's wars. So strongly did Arthur Sulzberger Jr. feel that the situation that he was compelled to personally apologize for America's involvement in these wars to a group of college graduates in 2006. This all leads up to probably the most notorious thing that the New York Times has ever done. In August 14, 2019, the New York Times launched one of its most ambitious and far-reaching initiatives in the history of the paper, called the 1619 Project. This endeavor would encompass the entire 100 pages of the New York Times Sunday magazine, spanning tens of thousands of words and dozens of photos devoted to a single topic. Its stated aim, the stated aim of the 1619 Project was to, quote, reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the historical narrative.
you are calling for reparations. What is the total that would be owed?
$14 trillion.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
Big debt, though.
It is a big debt.
We are still fighting. As long as there's life, we're going to have hope.
When I hear fog, I hear freedom.
There are centuries in that music, centuries in that spirit.
The 1619 Project, it's not a history. It really is talking about America today. Black Americans' contributions are undeniable. No people had a greater claim to the American flag than we do.
This fully explains the seemingly cryptic opening statement of the main essay in the magazine, which states, "Our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written." It's precisely this subversion of history that the Times had in mind when it declared its intent to reframe the history of the United States. While the claims were so far from the mainstream dialogue in American history, so nearly unimaginable to most Times readers, the ideas were presented not as theory or hypothesis, but hard fact. So I guess that really is the culmination of the entire history of the Times. And again, guys like Ashley will say that, you know, this was just an evolution. I'm like, no, from the very fucking beginning of the New York Times, it sounds like they were stupid, they were careless, or they were ideologically tilted. It sounds like for the majority of the New York Times' history, they have been flirtatious or outright, you know, advocating for communism. That seems, and that, to me, that culminates in the 1619 Project. That's another fucking Marxist Jewish piece of fucking revisionist history that's specifically rolled out to make white people feel bad about themselves. There's no truth. And the fact that they've departed from the truth, they were never part of the truth. They never had an interest in the truth. They had interest in telling a fucking story. Like Jon Stewart, like all the late night guys, like everyone. There is no individual in this entire journalistic ecosystem that gives a shit about the truth. That's why people hate journalists. That's why they've always hated journalists. And what journalists love doing is telling stories about themselves. And that it's so fucking loathsome. And these are the types of people that we have in our spaces. The people who are only there for prestige. If anyone is there for any reason, it's to be manipulative, to use this as a force amplifier for their own priors, for their own agenda. That's all journalism is. It should be the truth. Truth has never been a part of it. Just like, you know, these spaces that we're talking about, they're force amplifiers for these people's twisted fucking priors. Anyway, and then when journalists get invited to them, you know, they get chewed up and spat out, but you're all the same motherfuckers. There's no difference between the people at these like vibe parties and the journalists that they mock. You know why they hate journalists? Because it's cool to hate journalists. I've been hating journalists for a long fucking time. We both have.
Never liked them. Never liked them. Was not a day that I ever liked journalists.
The Bloods who are listening, they know they've been hating journalists since before it was cool.
In the period of your life when you were a journalist, I hated you.
I did work for I worked for like a small paper. I worked for
you did, and at that time, were you and I on speaking terms?
I think
no,
so.
we weren't. We were not. We weren't talking to each other for like 2 years. We were having a big fight.
I think this was after that.
No, the way I remember it is because you were a journalist.
The way I remember this is our own little 1619 project. But maybe because I wasn't. You would have been in Hong Kong by then too. Yeah.
I don't. It's the dates are all wrong.
It was. I did work for briefly for a local newspaper, and I was like a reporter. I would go to events and write the stories, do the interviews.
Obviously, we're not talking about people at local papers. I was going to say about the meme that newspapers have always been in search of truth, and this is just an aberration. The whole thing with media is to the extent to which it has power over people's decision making is the extent to which it will be corrupted at all times. So the reason New York Times is especially corrupt is because it's especially well read and broad, right? Local papers are they're probably a little bit corrupt, but nobody is willing to throw millions of dollars at corrupting a local paper because there's no readership. So it doesn't matter, right? It's inconsequential. And for that reason, you can have local papers that are going to have honest reporting, or at the very
Yeah.
least, at the most, the bias would just be the bias of the reporter because he doesn't like this one guy or something.
The
right?
funny thing is, the thing I was doing in my charge as a reporter was the thing that journalists hate doing, which was just getting the who, what, where, when, why, and how.
Like reporting.
Yeah, which is like I went to the fair, and there was a horse, and the mayor showed up, and he said, "What a great fair this is! It was sunny. Everyone had a good time. This reporter had some cotton candy."
Yeah.
But didn't have enough room for the funnel cake.
I read the county paper where I am now, and I actually like it. It's all online now. Like, we don't get the paper version, but I actually read it, and it's like, oh, that's neat. Oh, I'm sorry I missed that. I wish I had gone to the fair last weekend. That looks like fun.
Yeah, what a journalist would do. Let's take the eclipse that just occurred as an example. A reporter like me would say, like, "Hey, eclipse happened. An eclipse is when the moon goes over the sun, and you're not supposed to look at it." And no one did, because there's been no reports of anyone going blind. So everyone had a good time at the eclipse. Whereas, like, a journalist would say, like, "Yeah, but what does that have to do with like Satanism?
Black
what
bodies.
What does that have to do with black bodies? Like, who were the glasses given out to more white people than black? What's that about? Like, what's the distribution of the glass? Like, you start with like a deconstructive mindset that you want to use this as something you could wield against society. You start with the agenda, but no one likes reporting. No one likes just going to an event and saying what happened at the event. But it's like the truest form of, if not truth telling, then fact reporting, because that's the type of news you want to see. You want to open a paper and it's a lot of people having a good time. There's a story about a guy whose dog was caught under a tractor, and he lifted up the tractor, and the dog survived.
Dog's fine. Yep.
That's a great story.
It's a great story. You genuinely love to see it.
You set your watch to that story. That story caused several births. That caused a lot of women got pregnant to that story. how many people got fucking pregnant to that article we did about I went to the Praxis party? that nullified gallons of semen for those who read it. That got a lot of guys pregnant. You don't want to fucking. How many men got pregnant reading that fucking story? Guilty.
Jesus.
What a great way to end the show. Okay.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.